The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the annual summer fete had drawn nearly every resident to gather beneath the ancient elm trees. Bunting fluttered lazily in the warm breeze, and the sweet scent of Mrs. Bantry's prize roses mingled with the more prosaic aromas of tea and freshly baked scones from the various stalls scattered across the lawn. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair beside the tea tent, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's booty, though anyone who knew her well might wonder whose baby could possibly require quite so many booties as Miss Marple seemed to produce. Her pale blue eyes, mild and seemingly unfocused, took in the cheerful chaos around her with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that people revealed their true natures most clearly when they believed themselves unobserved. The centerpiece of today's festivities was to be a demonstration of change ringing by the church bell ringers, led by Mr. Arthur Thornfield, the village's most accomplished campanologist. Arthur was a man of precise habits and considerable pride in his craft. Perhaps too much pride, some whispered, though none could deny his skill. At 55, he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, particularly when the subject was bells. The grandsire triples will begin promptly at 3 o'clock, Arthur had announced earlier to anyone within hearing distance, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never missed a practice in 30 years. I trust everyone will appreciate the precision required for such a complex method. Miss Marple had observed the small gathering around Arthur with interest. There was Mrs. Evelyn Carmichael, the vicar's wife, whose bright smile seemed to require considerable effort to maintain whenever Arthur spoke. Beside her stood young Peter Ashford, the newest member of the bell-ringing team, whose eager enthusiasm appeared to irritate Arthur considerably. Most intriguing was the presence of Miss Dorothy Hartwell, the village librarian, who had been notably absent from bell-ringing activities since a rather public disagreement with Arthur about the proper care of the tower's historical records. I do hope Arthur remembers that this is meant to be entertainment, not examination, murmured Colonel Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a grunt of satisfaction. The man takes his bells rather seriously. Serious men often have serious troubles, Miss Marple observed mildly, her needles never pausing, though I'm sure Mr. Thornfield simply wants everything to go well. As the appointed hour approached, the bell-ringers made their way toward St. Mary's Tower. Arthur led the procession with characteristic precision, followed by Peter Ashford, whose nervous energy was evident in his quick, darting glances toward the assembled crowd. Mrs. Carmichael walked. With them, though, Miss Marple noted she carried a small leather satchel that seemed oddly heavy for someone attending a bell-ringing demonstration. Most curious of all was Miss Hartwell's last-minute decision to join the group, despite her recent estrangement from the team. "How lovely that Dorothy has decided to participate after all," commented Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed social chronicler. "Though I must say she's been rather odd lately. Only yesterday she was asking the most peculiar questions about the tower keys." The church bells began their call precisely at 3 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the village with mathematical precision. Miss Marple found herself counting the changes, a habit from her youth when she had briefly fancied herself a bell-ringer. The pattern was complex but steady. Grandsire triples, just as Arthur had promised. Then, quite suddenly, the bells fell silent. Not the gradual ceremonial conclusion that would mark the end of a successful demonstration, but an abrupt, jarring cessation that left the air feeling strangely empty. The crowd on the green looked up at the tower with mild confusion, then growing concern as the silence stretched on. "That's not right," muttered Colonel Bantry, his military instincts alert to anything out of order. "They've barely been at it 10 minutes. Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful deliberation. In her experience, when things that should continue suddenly stopped, there was usually a very good reason, and that reason was rarely pleasant. Young Timothy Fletcher, the vicar's son, came running from the direction of the church, his face pale with excitement and something that might have been fear. "Father," he called to the Reverend Fletcher, who was manning the bookstall with admirable dedication. "Father, you must come quickly. There's been an accident in the tower." The word accident rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the fluid motion of someone whose age was more a matter of appearance than limitation. She had learned long ago that the first few minutes after such announcements were often the most revealing, before people had time to compose their faces and arrange their thoughts. As the crowd began to move toward the church, Miss Marple noticed several interesting details. Mrs. Carmichael emerged from the tower looking distinctly shaken, her leather satchel now noticeably lighter. Peter Ashford appeared in the doorway, his face white as paper, one hand pressed against the stone archway as if he needed its support. Miss Hartwell was nowhere to be seen. But it was the absence of Arthur Thornfield that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that this was no ordinary accident. In 30 years, Arthur had never failed to appear promptly after a ringing session to accept the congratulations he felt were his due. His absence could mean only one thing. As they reached the tower entrance, Dr. Haydock was already climbing the narrow stone steps, his medical bag in hand. The sounds that drifted down, low voices, urgent whispers, and one quickly stifled sob, painted a picture that Miss Marple's experienced mind had already begun to compose. When Dr. Haydock emerged 20 minutes later, his face grave, he confirmed what she had suspected. "I'm afraid Arthur Thornfield is dead," he announced quietly to the small group gathered in the churchyard. "It appears he suffered some sort of seizure during the ringing. Most unfortunate." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mild blue eyes were very thoughtful indeed. She had noticed the faint scent of bitter almonds that had wafted from the tower when the door first opened, and she had observed the way Mrs. Carmichael's hands trembled as she clutched her now empty satchel. Most telling of all, she had seen the expression of relief, quickly suppressed but unmistakable, that had crossed Peter Ashford's face when Dr. Haydock announced his preliminary conclusion. As the crowd began to disperse in hushed, excited groups, Miss Marple retrieved her knitting and settled back into her chair. The summer fete would continue, of course. Life in St. Mary Mead had a way of flowing around such interruptions like water around a stone. But she suspected that before this particular stone was fully submerged, it would create some very interesting ripples indeed. After all, in her considerable experience, men who took their bells as seriously as Arthur Thornfield rarely suffered convenient seizures at precisely the moment when their authority was being challenged. And the bells of St. Mary's, she reflected, had been ringing for over 400 years. They had witnessed many secrets in their time. Today, she suspected, they had witnessed murder. The summer fete continued with the determined cheerfulness that small villages summon in the face of tragedy, though the laughter seemed forced and conversations carried an undercurrent of nervous energy. Miss Marple remained in her wicker chair, knitting needles clicking steadily as she observed the subtle shifts in behavior that death invariably brought to light. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first at her side, fanning herself despite the cooling air. Such a shock, Miss Marple, though Arthur had been looking rather strained lately. All that business with the new ringing methods, the stress must have been considerable. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, I always thought he pushed himself too hard. Men his age shouldn't take on such demanding projects." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically while noting that Mrs. Price Ridley seemed remarkably well informed about Arthur's recent activities for someone who had never shown interest in campanology. She filed this observation away with growing curiosity. Colonel Bantry appeared shortly after, ostensibly checking on her nerves, but clearly seeking refuge from his wife's increasingly dramatic recounting. "Damned peculiar business, Jane. Haydock seemed rather rushed in his examination. Fellows usually more thorough, wouldn't you say?" This was interesting indeed. Dr. Haydock's hasty conclusion suggested either genuine medical certainty or a desire to avoid uncomfortable questions. Miss Marple wondered which it might be, particularly given the faint scent of bitter almonds she had detected earlier. The most illuminating visit came from Mrs. Carmichael, who arrived as the church bells chimed 6 o'clock. The vicar's wife had clearly been crying, though she made valiant efforts at composure. Miss Marple noticed immediately that the leather satchel, so noticeably heavy when entering the tower, now seemed almost empty. "I keep thinking there must have been something I could do," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice trembling. Arthur seemed perfectly well when we began, though perhaps more irritable than usual. The strangest thing was how he insisted on checking the ropes himself before we started. He was quite particular about it, almost as if he suspected something might be wrong. "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple observed mildly, her eyes noting a small dark stain on Mrs. Carmichael's white cuff, hastily concealed beneath her sleeve. "He also asked me to bring my medical supplies, just in case. Said one could never be too careful with new ringers." Mrs. Carmichael's cheeks colored slightly. He seemed almost, well, suspicious might be too strong a word, but certainly more cautious than usual. After Mrs. Carmichael departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, watching shadows lengthen across her garden. The picture emerging was becoming clearer. Arthur Thornfield had been expecting trouble, enough to request medical supplies and personally inspect equipment he normally trusted to others. Young Peter Ashford appeared as evening approached, looking haggard and considerably older than his 26 years. He perched nervously on his chair's edge, declining tea and fidgeting with his cap. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, for not making a fuss this afternoon. Some others have been asking rather pointed questions about what happened." His face showed the peculiar relief she had noticed earlier, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "I'm sure they're simply concerned," Miss Marple replied gently. "It must have been distressing." It was horrible. One moment Arthur was calling changes perfectly normally, then he just collapsed. There was nothing we could do. Peter hesitated, then continued. Arthur had been acting strangely lately, almost paranoid. He'd been asking odd questions about tower access, checking things that never concerned him before. Yesterday, he even suggested someone might be trying to sabotage the bell-ringing team. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. How peculiar. Did he say who he suspected? No, but he kept looking at Dorothy Hartwell whenever he mentioned it. They'd had that terrible row about the historical records. Arthur accused her of being careless with the tower keys. Peter stood abruptly. "I should go. Thank you for being so understanding." As Peter hurried into the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. Arthur Thornfield had been a suspicious, careful man who had nonetheless walked directly into what appeared to be his own death. The question was whether his suspicions had been justified, and if so, whether he had suspected the right person. Most intriguing was Dorothy Hartwell's complete absence from the aftermath. No expressions of shock, no theories offered, no presence at all. In Miss Marple's experience, innocent people rarely made themselves so conspicuously absent when tragedy struck their immediate circle. The church bells chimed 8 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying clearly across the village. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay Miss Dorothy Hartwell a visit. After all, librarians often possessed surprisingly extensive knowledge about the most unexpected subjects, including, perhaps, the precise effects of certain botanical compounds that might produce both the scent of bitter almonds and a very convenient seizure. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead's cobblestones as Miss Marple made her way through the village, her walking stick tapping a gentle rhythm. Word of Arthur Thornfield's death had spread with the efficiency that small communities reserved for significant events, and she observed the subtle changes it had wrought in familiar faces. At the post office, Mr. Pottle mentioned with unusual gravity that a registered letter had arrived for Arthur just yesterday. Something from a London collectors' society that had required Arthur's irritated signature. Mrs. Lumley at the grocer's declared with newfound authority that sudden deaths ran in the Thornfield family, though nobody could recall hearing this before. The conversations carried an undercurrent of nervous energy, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple's destination was the library, where she arrived precisely as Miss Dorothy Hartwell was unlocking the heavy oak doors. Dorothy, usually a model of efficient composure, showed telling signs of strain. Her hands trembled slightly with the key, and her customary neat bun sat askew on her head. "Miss Marple, how unexpected to see you so early." Dorothy's voice carried its usual authority, though pitched higher than normal. "I'm afraid we're not quite ready for visitors." "I do hope you don't mind, dear. I couldn't sleep after yesterday's dreadful events." Miss Marple's tone was apologetic, almost diffident. "Such a shock about poor Mr. Thornfield." Dorothy's grip tightened visibly on the door handle. "Yes, quite shocking, though I understand Dr. Haydock believes it was natural causes." Miss Marple noted with interest how well-informed Dorothy was about the doctor's preliminary conclusions, considering her notable absence from yesterday's discussions. Inside the library's cool interior, she detected something beyond the usual scents of old paper and leather, a faint chemical odor that seemed oddly familiar. "I was thinking of something botanical," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Gardening has always been such a comfort, though I must confess I sometimes worry about the more dangerous plants. One reads such alarming things about certain species." Dorothy's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her face went pale, and she knocked over a brass paperweight in her haste to move behind the circulation desk. "Dangerous plants? Whatever do you mean?" "Oh, you know how it is, dear. Foxglove, oleander, those pretty little berries that look so harmless. I was reading recently about bitter almonds. Fascinating how they can affect the system." The librarian's composure cracked visibly. "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about such things. My interests are purely literary." She gestured toward a returns cart with jerky motions. "Perhaps something from our fiction collection." Miss Marple approached the cart with apparent innocence, her eyes quickly scanning the hastily assembled titles. Among innocuous novels lay 3 volumes that caught her attention: Medicinal Plants of Britain, Historical Poisons and Their Effects, and most significantly, The Bell Ringer's Companion, a complete guide to Tower protocols. The botanical guide fell open naturally to a chapter on cyanogenic glycosides, its margins bearing faint pencil notations. "How thoughtful of you to gather these," Miss Marple observed mildly. "The bell-ringing book is particularly interesting. I didn't realize such technical literature was available." "Just general returns," Dorothy said quickly, moving to block Miss Marple's view. "People do read the most curious things." Miss Marple borrowed a volume of poetry and prepared to leave, pausing at the door. "I do hope the tower keys will be properly managed now. Such important historical artifacts deserve careful attention." Dorothy's response was barely audible. "I'm sure arrangements will be made." Walking home through the brightening morning, Miss Marple reflected on the encounter. Dorothy Hartwell certainly had motive. Her public humiliation over the tower keys had clearly rankled deeply. She had opportunity, having admitted to accessing the tower that morning for cataloging purposes. The botanical research suggested method, and her behavior indicated guilt. Yet something troubled Miss Marple's orderly mind. Dorothy's guilt seemed almost too obvious, her suspicious behavior too transparent for someone who had successfully committed murder. In her considerable experience, the most obvious suspect was rarely the correct one. The real killer usually possessed the cunning to deflect suspicion onto others while maintaining an appearance of innocence. As church bells chimed 10 o'clock, Miss Marple wondered if Dorothy Hartwell was indeed Arthur Thornfield's murderer, or simply a convenient scapegoat for someone far more clever. Inspector Slack arrived before noon with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to bringing order to rural confusion. He established himself in the church hall with military efficiency, positioning Constable Lake at strategic points and requesting that the vicar keep the space available for interviews. The village, gratified by this display of official attention, settled into its favorite occupation of watching authority at work. Miss Marple, ostensibly delivering a basket of preserves for the parish relief fund, accepted a chair near the tea urn and became, to all appearances, part of the furniture. Her mild blue eyes observed the subtle choreography of nervous villagers preparing to be questioned, noting particularly how Mrs. Carmichael moved about with determined efficiency, her leather satchel now conspicuously absent. Dorothy Hartwell was summoned first, entering the hall with her chin raised and spectacles gleaming with defiant dignity. Inspector Slack wasted no time on pleasantries. "Miss Hartwell, you had a public disagreement with Mr. Thornfield regarding tower access. You possess extensive knowledge of botanical subjects, including toxic plants, and you were present when he collapsed. I trust you understand why we need to speak with you." Dorothy's flush was immediate and revealing. "My interest in botany is purely academic, Inspector. Those library books were for a lecture series on historical medicinal practices. As for the keys, my concerns were entirely professional. Mr. Thornfield was mishandling historical documents." "What sort of mishandling?" Slack leaned forward with sharpened interest. Dorothy hesitated, glancing toward the vicar before continuing. "He intended to remove certain pages from the parish registers. There are records from 1919 regarding the sale of a Sanctus bell clapper to a London museum. The correspondence suggests irregularities. The item may never have reached its intended destination. Mr. Thornfield implied that prominent local families would be embarrassed if these questions were raised again." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. Historical scandals often provided remarkably persistent motives for present-day violence, particularly when reputations and possibly money were at stake. "And where exactly were you when Mr. Thornfield collapsed?" Slack continued. "In the ringing chamber, managing the third rope. When Arthur called for us to stand, I looked up and saw him stagger, clutching his throat before falling. I ran immediately to summon help." "Did you offer him anything to eat or drink during the session?" "Certainly not. Arthur always brought his own refreshments. A small flask he kept in his coat pocket. He was quite particular about such things." When Dorothy was dismissed, Peter Ashford was called forward. The young man appeared considerably more composed than the previous day, though Miss Marple detected an underlying relief that seemed oddly premature for someone grieving a mentor's death. "You discovered the body?" Slack inquired. "I ran for Dr. Haydock the moment Arthur fell. I passed Mrs. Carmichael on the stairs. She was bringing medical supplies in case of emergency." Peter's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "Arthur had been increasingly anxious about the new ringing methods. He'd even asked me to watch for any unusual behavior around the tower." "Unusual behavior from whom?" Peter glanced uncomfortably toward where Dorothy had been sitting. He had become quite suspicious of Dorothy since their argument. He was convinced she might attempt some form of revenge. Miss Marple observed Peter's hands as he spoke, noting calluses and muscle development that seemed inconsistent with his claimed novice status. In her experience, bell ringing left very specific marks on those who practiced it extensively. Mrs. Carmichael's interview proved equally illuminating. The vicar's wife maintained her composure admirably, though Miss Marple noticed a faint discoloration on her ring finger, a small stain that resembled chemical burning, carefully concealed beneath her wedding band. "You brought medical supplies to the tower?" Slack asked. Arthur had requested them. He suffered from episodes of high blood pressure and wanted precautions taken. Mrs. Carmichael's explanation was smooth, practiced. "I brought sal volatile and other basic remedies." "Your satchel appeared quite heavy when entering the tower, but much lighter when you emerged." "I had also brought some old hymn books for the jumble sale. Heavy prayer books, you understand. I left them in the vestry." Dr. Haydock, when questioned, was characteristically blunt. The symptoms and that distinctive odor suggest hydrocyanic acid poisoning. I've requested a proper post-mortem examination, but the preliminary signs are quite clear. And how might someone obtain such a substance? Slack inquired. Photography laboratories use it for developing solutions, certain industrial processes. It's not as exotic as people imagine, though certainly dangerous in the wrong hands. As the interviews concluded, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging picture. Dorothy Hartwell certainly presented as the obvious suspect, motive, knowledge, and opportunity all neatly aligned. Yet something about the woman's transparent distress suggested genuine shock rather than the satisfaction of successful revenge. More intriguing were the subtle inconsistencies in other testimonies. Peter's relief seemed disproportionate for someone who had merely witnessed a tragic accident. Mrs. Carmichael's chemical stains and the mysterious contents of her satchel raised questions that her explanations didn't quite address. Most curious was Peter's mention of Arthur's retirement plans, a detail that seemed fundamentally at odds with everything the village knew about Arthur Thornfield's character. Walking home, through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple encountered Peter Ashford near the village pond. Their conversation revealed an unexpected detail. Peter claimed Arthur had been planning to retire next year, intending to pass the master ringer position to his young protégé. He could be quite demanding, Peter confided, always finding fault, always expecting perfection. He'd been particularly critical lately about my relationship with Dorothy, said it was distracting me from proper focus on the bells. This revelation added another layer to the developing picture. A romantic attachment between Peter and Dorothy would certainly complicate Inspector Slack's neat theory, while also providing additional motive for Arthur's removal from their lives. As the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with a mind full of contradictions. The official investigation was proceeding with satisfying efficiency toward an obvious conclusion. Dorothy Hartwell had motive, means, and opportunity. The evidence against her was mounting steadily. Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most obvious suspect was rarely the correct one. In her considerable experience, successful murderers possessed the cunning to deflect suspicion onto others while maintaining careful appearances of innocence. Dorothy's behavior suggested panic and confusion rather than calculated guilt. Tomorrow, she decided, she would need to examine more closely the curious discrepancies in the testimonies she had heard today. Someone was lying about Arthur Thornfield's retirement plans, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that evidence pointed toward Dorothy Hartwell. The question was whether Dorothy was indeed a murderer, or simply a very convenient scapegoat for someone far more clever than Inspector Slack was prepared to consider. Miss Marple arrived at St. Mary's with the dawn light, ostensibly to arrange flowers, but actually to examine details that daylight might reveal more clearly. The church held that peculiar stillness of a place where death had recently visited, and she moved through it with the careful attention of someone who understood that important truths often hid in the smallest observations. In the vestry, she noticed immediately that the tower key hung with its teeth pointing upward. A detail that would mean nothing to most observers, but Reverend Fletcher was meticulous about hanging all keys with teeth downward. Someone unfamiliar with his habits had replaced it hastily. More telling was the faint chemical residue she detected on the key itself, a trace that suggested recent contact with something more potent than ordinary metal polish. Her examination of the bell tower proved even more illuminating. The ringing chamber retained that faint almond scent she had noticed yesterday, concentrated near Arthur's usual position. Most significantly, she observed that the sally of the fifth bell showed a curious stiffening and dulling of its blue wool, as though it had been dampened with some solution and dried hastily. Arthur's well-known habit of patting each sally before beginning a session would have ensured contact with any substance applied to the rope. As she descended, young Timothy Fletcher appeared with the breathless excitement of a boy who had made an important discovery. "Miss Marple, I found the most curious thing buried in the churchyard," right where the bell ringers gather before going up. He produced a small pharmaceutical vial with traces of clear liquid still clinging to its sides. I saw someone burying it last night after the fete. Looked like Mrs. Carmichael, though it was getting quite dark. Miss Marple examined the vial with interest, noting both its professional markings and the unmistakable scent that confirmed her growing suspicions. Someone had been careless enough to bury evidence in shallow ground, yet clever enough to ensure it would be discovered after suspicion had firmly settled on Dorothy Hartwell. But it was her reflection on the bells themselves that provided the most crucial insight. Miss Marple had spent enough time around campanology in her youth to understand the mechanics of change ringing. If Arthur Thornfield had indeed suffered a sudden, incapacitating seizure while calling changes, his collapse would have created chaos. His rope going slack or swinging wildly, his bell crashing out of rhythm, disrupting the entire peal. The other ringers would have struggled to maintain control, creating a cacophony of clashing bells or a messy, staggered halt. Instead, the bells had stopped cleanly and suddenly, as if someone had deliberately brought the entire sequence to an immediate, coordinated end. This suggested conscious action by someone who remained in control, someone who understood bell ringing well enough to secure Arthur's rope and prevent the natural chaos his collapse would have caused. When she encountered Mrs. Carmichael arranging altar flowers, their conversation revealed another crucial detail. Peter was quite quick, Mrs. Carmichael mentioned. He managed to secure Arthur's rope so it didn't cause more trouble. Very sensible for a young man. This explained the clean cessation perfectly. Peter Ashford, the supposed novice, had possessed both the skill and presence of mind to act decisively in that critical moment. Combined with the calluses she'd observed on his hands, marks inconsistent with his claimed beginner status, a different picture emerged entirely. Colonel Bantry's morning visit brought additional intelligence that Peter had suddenly remembered seeing Dorothy with Arthur's flask 30 minutes before the ringing began. In Miss Marple's experience, genuine witnesses rarely waited 24 hours to recall such crucial details, particularly young men whose beloved's innocence or guilt might hang in the balance. Most intriguing was Dorothy's afternoon revelation about the 1919 correspondence regarding a missing bell clapper. The final letter bore the signature of a Mr. Carmichael, then a junior solicitor, who had advised the parish to abandon their inquiry into the clapper's disappearance. If Mrs. Carmichael was related to this earlier scandal, Arthur's recent investigation into parish irregularities would have posed a considerable threat to her family's reputation. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. Dorothy Hartwell remained the obvious suspect, with evidence accumulating against her with suspicious efficiency. Yet the very neatness troubled her experienced instincts. The buried vial, Peter's convenient memory, the manipulated physical evidence, all pointed to a careful campaign to establish Dorothy's guilt while deflecting attention from the true perpetrator. The technical evidence of the bell's clean cessation suggested someone with genuine expertise had managed the aftermath of Arthur's poisoning. Peter Ashford, despite his protestations of novice status, clearly possessed both the knowledge and capability to have orchestrated the entire sequence, from applying poison to the fifth sally to securing Arthur's rope to prevent chaos, ensuring the crime appeared as a simple collapse during ringing practice. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would need to examine more closely whether Peter was desperately protecting his beloved Dorothy or something far more dangerous, a calculating killer who had found the perfect scapegoat for his carefully planned crime. The morning mist had barely lifted when Miss Marple arrived at St. Mary's, her stated purpose being the arrangement of altar flowers, though her true intention lay in examining details that daylight might illuminate more clearly. The church retained that peculiar stillness of a place where violence had recently intruded upon sanctity, and she moved through it with the careful attention of someone who understood that truth often resided in the smallest observations. Her examination of the bell tower proved immediately rewarding. The ringing chamber still held that faint almond scent she had detected yesterday, concentrated near Arthur's customary position. Most significantly, she observed that the sally of the fifth bell showed a curious stiffening and discoloration of its blue wool, as though it had been treated with some chemical solution and allowed to dry hastily. Arthur's well-documented habit of checking each sally before beginning practice would have ensured prolonged contact with any substance applied to the rope. In the vestry, she discovered Arthur's leather-bound practice journal, apparently overlooked in yesterday's excitement. His meticulous handwriting revealed a man growing increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, but his final entry, dated the morning of his death, proved most illuminating. Must confront PA today about the deception. 3 years of Oxford campanology cannot be hidden from someone who understands the craft. Why does he persist in this charade of inexperience? Dr. Haydick's arrival with the post-mortem results confirmed her growing suspicions about the murder method. Hydrocyanic acid poisoning, certainly. But the tissue analysis suggests something rather more sophisticated than a single exposure, he reported with professional gravity. The concentration patterns indicate repeated small doses over several weeks, building up the toxin in his system until a final, larger application triggered the fatal seizure. Quite clever, actually. It would have created the appearance of declining health that made sudden collapse seem plausible. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding completely. Someone with intimate knowledge of Arthur's habits had been slowly poisoning him, using his own meticulous routines against him. The stiffened sally suggested the final dose had been applied that very morning, timed precisely for maximum effect during the demonstration. Her conversation with Mrs. Carmichael at the vicarage revealed another crucial piece of the puzzle. The vicar's wife appeared haggard, her usual composure replaced by barely contained anxiety. Miss Marple noted immediately the faint chemical burns on her hands, hastily concealed beneath fresh gloves. Arthur had become quite impossible lately, Mrs. Carmichael confided, her voice trembling slightly. He'd been researching that dreadful business from 1919, the missing bell clapper. He claimed to have found correspondence proving my husband's uncle had facilitated the theft, covering it up to protect prominent families. Arthur was threatening to publish his findings during the summer fete, to expose what he called the corruption at the heart of St. Mary Mead. "How distressing for you, dear," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. "And young Peter, he must have been caught between his loyalty to Arthur and his affection for Miss Hartwell." Mrs. Carmichael's expression grew troubled. "That's just it, Miss Marple. Peter wasn't the devoted protégé he appeared to be. Arthur had discovered that Peter had been lying about his experience from the very beginning. He'd rung at Oxford for 3 years. He was accomplished enough to be a tower captain himself. Arthur felt utterly betrayed by the deception. The final piece of the puzzle emerged during her encounter with Peter himself near the village pond. Gone was the nervous enthusiasm of the supposed novice. In its place was a calculating wariness that confirmed her suspicions. When she mentioned Arthur's retirement plans, Peter's mask slipped momentarily. "Arthur wasn't planning to retire," he said with sudden vehemence. "He was planning to expose everyone, Mrs. Carmichael's family, Dorothy's supposed incompetence, my deception about bell-ringing experience. He'd become a vindictive old man who enjoyed having power over people." The bitter resentment in his voice was unmistakable. He deserved what happened to him. Miss Marple observed Peter's hands as he spoke, the calluses and muscle development that spoke of years of serious bell-ringing, the steady confidence of his movements that belied any claim of inexperience. Most telling was his immediate understanding of technical campanology. Terms she dropped into conversation, responses that came too quickly and knowledgeably for someone supposedly new to the craft. As she walked home through the lengthening afternoon shadows, Miss Marple reflected on the elegant cruelty of Peter's plan. By slowly poisoning Arthur over several weeks with small applications of cyanide to equipment he handled regularly, Peter had created the appearance of declining health. His positioning of Dorothy as the obvious suspect, with her botanical knowledge, access to the tower, and public quarrel with Arthur, provided Inspector Slack with a neat solution requiring no uncomfortable investigation into deeper motives. The buried vial had been pure theater, designed to be discovered after suspicion had settled firmly on Dorothy. Peter's quick thinking in securing Arthur's rope during the crisis had actually been essential to prevent the chaos that would have revealed the murder's precise timing. His convenient memories of Dorothy's suspicious behavior were calculated additions to strengthen the case against her. Most chilling was the realization that Peter had been manipulating everyone from the beginning. His courtship of Dorothy, his humble apprentice act with Arthur, his helpful cooperation with the investigation, all had been carefully orchestrated elements of a plan that would remove Arthur Thornfield and destroy Dorothy Hartwell simultaneously, clearing Peter's path to prominence in the bell-ringing community, while eliminating the two people who posed the greatest threats to his carefully constructed new identity. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would need to act swiftly. Peter's plan was proceeding exactly as intended, with Dorothy's arrest appearing increasingly inevitable. The young man had proven himself a master of deception, using his apparent helpfulness to deflect suspicion while systematically destroying the woman he claimed to love. But she had learned, long ago, that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most eager to assist the investigation, and Peter Ashford had been remarkably thorough in providing evidence against everyone except himself. The morning brought news that confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears. Inspector Slack had obtained a warrant for Dorothy Hartwell's arrest. The evidence against her had reached what he considered overwhelming proportions, and the village buzzed with the uncomfortable satisfaction that came from having their suspicions officially validated. Miss Marple arrived at the library just as Dorothy was locking the doors for what might be the final time. The librarian's carefully maintained composure had finally cracked completely. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the heavy keys, and tears streamed openly down her pale cheeks. "Miss Marple, I don't understand what's happening," Dorothy whispered desperately. "Peter came to see me last night, and he was so strange, almost triumphant. He kept talking about how we could be together now that Arthur was gone, but when I mentioned feeling guilty about our quarrel, his whole manner changed. He became cold, calculating. It frightened me." This revelation provided crucial confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions. Peter's mask was beginning to slip as success appeared within reach, revealing glimpses of the calculating personality beneath his carefully constructed facade of devoted inexperience. "Tell me about Peter's bell-ringing abilities," Miss Marple requested gently. "Has he ever demonstrated skills beyond what a beginner might possess?" Dorothy's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Last month, when Arthur was ill with that stomach complaint, Peter stepped in to conduct practice. He managed a complex Stedman doubles without hesitation, something that should have been impossible for someone with only 6 months' experience. When I mentioned it afterward, he became quite agitated and made me promise not to tell Arthur. The stomach complaint provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple realized that Peter's systematic poisoning had begun months earlier, with small doses designed to weaken Arthur gradually while establishing a pattern of declining health that would make sudden collapse seem plausible. Her afternoon visit to Mrs. Carmichael revealed the full extent of Peter's psychological manipulation. The vicar's wife appeared haggard, her usual composure replaced by barely contained anxiety and guilt. "He'd been visiting me regularly for weeks," Mrs. Carmichael confessed, her voice barely audible. "He claimed to be concerned about Arthur's research into the 1919 scandal, offering to help protect my family's reputation. He suggested that someone with botanical knowledge might solve the problem permanently, and when I protested, he reminded me how much Dorothy resented Arthur." Miss Marple understood immediately how Peter had positioned himself as the helpful intermediary while planting seeds of suspicion about Dorothy. His apparent concern for Mrs. Carmichael's welfare had been calculated to make her an unwitting accomplice in building the case against Dorothy. He even offered to obtain certain substances through his photography hobby. Mrs. Carmichael continued, her shame evident. When I refused, he suggested I might accidentally leave my medical supplies where someone else could access them. I feel so foolish now, but he seemed so genuinely worried about everyone involved. Dr. Haydick's evening visit brought additional disturbing confirmation. I've been reviewing Arthur's medical records from the past 3 months, he reported grimly. The pattern of symptoms he described, digestive issues, fatigue, occasional dizziness, are entirely consistent with chronic low-level cyanide exposure. Someone had been systematically poisoning him for weeks, possibly through equipment he handled regularly. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Doctor, would such repeated exposure leave any discernible traces on the perpetrator's skin? Indeed, regular contact with cyanide compounds would likely cause localized skin irritation, perhaps discoloration or mild dermatitis, particularly without proper protection. This observation struck Miss Marple as significant. Peter's hands had appeared remarkably smooth and unblemished for someone who had allegedly been handling poison, while Mrs. Carmichael bore the telltale chemical burns of someone who had indeed made contact with dangerous substances, though likely as an unwitting accomplice rather than the primary perpetrator. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the elegant cruelty of Peter's comprehensive plan. He had identified every potential threat to his ambitions and systematically neutralized each while positioning himself as the helpful, innocent bystander. His false identity as a bell-ringing novice had provided perfect cover for infiltrating the community and gaining intimate access to his victim. Most chilling was the realization that Peter's courtship of Dorothy had been entirely calculated from the beginning. By positioning himself as her romantic interest, he had created both a motive for removing Arthur and a means of deflecting suspicion from himself onto the woman he claimed to love. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided it would be time to spring her own carefully laid trap. Peter Ashford had proven himself a master of deception, but she had encountered such calculated evil before. His mistake had been allowing his growing confidence to reveal glimpses of his true nature just when he should have maintained his careful facade most rigorously. The morning brought an unexpected request from Miss Marple to Reverend Fletcher. Might she arrange a small memorial service for Arthur Thornfield, including a brief demonstration of the bells he had loved so dearly? The Reverend, touched by what seemed a genuine desire to honor the deceased, readily agreed. Inspector Slack, when approached, grumbled about sentimental nonsense, but consented to attend, positioning Constable Lake strategically near the tower entrance. Miss Marple arrived at St. Mary's carrying her knitting bag and wearing an expression of mild determination that those who knew her well might have recognized as dangerous. She had spent considerable time that morning in quiet conversation with various villagers, planting seeds of information that she suspected would bear interesting fruit. Mrs. Carmichael appeared visibly shaken from their earlier discussion about Dr. Haydick's findings regarding prolonged poison exposure and the telltale skin markings it might leave. Dorothy Hartwell came with the desperate hope that somehow this gathering might provide the vindication that seemed increasingly unlikely. Peter Ashford arrived with his characteristic helpful demeanor, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that suggested her morning conversations had already begun their work. "I thought perhaps a simple memorial touch," Miss Marple explained to the assembled group in the ringing chamber. "Nothing elaborate, just plain bob doubles, which even I remember from my youth, though I confess my memory for the technical details has grown quite unreliable." She positioned herself near the practice board with apparent confusion. Now, one begins with the treble leading, doesn't one? Or is it that one calls changes immediately? Her pencil hovered uncertainly over the chalked diagram. "I'm quite hopeless with these technical matters," Peter stepped forward with eager helpfulness. Actually, Miss Marple, in plain bob doubles, the treble leads a full pull first, then hunts up while the working bells— He stopped abruptly, awareness dawning too late. "How remarkably knowledgeable you've become," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Such complex terminology for someone with only a few months' experience." Dorothy's eyes widened as she stared at Peter. The technical explanation he had just provided required understanding that should have taken years to develop, not the brief apprenticeship he claimed. Undeterred, Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation. "Arthur was always so particular about the rope maintenance, wasn't he? I remember him checking each sally before practice, though I suppose one must be careful about what substances come into contact with the wool." "Absolutely," Peter agreed automatically. "Any foreign substance could stiffen the fibers and affect the grip. One has to be particularly careful about chemical residues that might—" Again, he caught himself, but the damage was evident. Inspector Slack, who understood nothing about bell ringing but recognized expertise when he heard it, stepped closer with sharpened interest. Mrs. Carmichael pressed a hand to her throat, remembering Peter's casual offers to obtain certain substances through his photography hobby. Miss Marple produced Arthur's practice journal from her knitting bag with the air of someone sharing an interesting discovery. "I've been puzzling over Arthur's final entry," she said conversationally. "He wrote about confronting someone regarding 3 years of deception and mentioned that Oxford campanology cannot be hidden from those who understand the craft. The initials PA appear quite prominently." The color drained from Peter's face as the implications settled over the group. Dorothy stared at him with growing horror, remembering his effortless conducting of complex methods during Arthur's illness, performances that now seemed impossible for a genuine novice. Arthur also noted his intention to expose what he called the corruption at the heart of our community, Miss Marple continued inexorably. He seemed particularly concerned about someone using false credentials to gain access to positions of trust. Peter's helpful mask was cracking visibly now. Arthur was paranoid in his final weeks, he said, his voice lacking its usual confident charm. He saw conspiracies everywhere. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed gently. Though Dr. Haydock's examination revealed that Arthur's declining health was quite real, the result of systematic poisoning over several weeks through equipment he handled regularly. Someone with intimate knowledge of his habits had been gradually weakening him before delivering the final, fatal dose. The accusation hung in the air like a bell stroke. Peter's hands, which had moved with unconscious expertise while discussing rope maintenance, now trembled slightly as he realized how thoroughly he had exposed himself. "The curious thing about expertise," Miss Marple mused, "is how difficult it becomes to feign ignorance once knowledge is truly acquired. Rather like trying to forget one's native language. The natural responses emerge despite one's best efforts to suppress them." As Inspector Slack moved closer, his official suspicions finally shifting from Dorothy to the young man whose carefully constructed identity was crumbling before their eyes, Miss Marple reflected on the elegant cruelty of Peter's original plan. He had positioned himself perfectly, the helpful novice, the devoted lover, the eager assistant to the investigation. His mistake had been allowing his growing confidence to override his caution, revealing precisely the expertise he had spent months concealing. Tomorrow, she suspected, would bring the final confrontation that would expose not just Peter's deception, but the full extent of his calculating manipulation of everyone who had trusted him. Miss Marple extended her invitation to Peter Ashford with the gentle insistence of an elderly lady who never quite noticed how busy young people claimed to be. He arrived punctually, his hat properly in hand, and that carefully arranged smile of helpful deference firmly in place. In her sitting room, with afternoon light filtering through white curtains and the familiar scent of lavender polish, she arranged her best china and offered seed cake with blackberry jam. "I wonder if you might help me with a small confusion about the bells," she began, her tone suggesting nothing more serious than a crossword puzzle. "I keep muddling whether in plain bob doubles the treble hunts up before or after the working bells make their changes. Arthur was always so particular about such details. The treble leads first, then hunts up while the working bells dodge," Peter responded automatically, then caught himself. "Though I'm still learning the finer points myself." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her mild eyes observing his unconscious expertise. "How remarkably clear you make it sound. I do admire precision, though sometimes it can reveal more than one intends." She offered him cake, which he declined with nervous politeness. "I've been reading Arthur's practice journal, you know. Such meticulous notes. His final entry mentioned an appointment with PA, about 3 years of deception and something about Oxford campanology that couldn't be hidden from those who understood the craft." The teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer as Peter set it down. Arthur had become rather paranoid in his final weeks. He saw conspiracies everywhere. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though Dr. Haydock's examination confirmed that his declining health was quite real, the result of systematic poisoning through equipment he handled regularly. Someone with intimate knowledge of his habits had been gradually weakening him before delivering the final dose. Peter's helpful mask began to crack as she continued with relentless gentleness. "The curious thing about the bells stopping so cleanly yesterday, no chaos, no wild swinging that Arthur's sudden collapse should have caused. Someone with considerable skill secured his rope immediately, preventing the natural disorder such an incident would create." "I simply reacted quickly," Peter said, but his voice lacked its usual confident charm. "Indeed. Remarkably quickly for someone supposedly new to the craft." Miss Marple produced a small vial from her knitting bag. "Young Timothy found this buried near the tower. Traces of hydrocyanic acid, Dr. Haydock confirms. Convenient evidence to be discovered after suspicion had settled firmly on poor Dorothy." Inspector Slack's footsteps on the garden path were clearly audible through the open window. He had arrived, as arranged, to collect Arthur's journal. Peter glanced toward the sound with growing desperation. "You orchestrated everything beautifully," Miss Marple observed. "The systematic poisoning using Dorothy's unwitting botanical knowledge, Mrs. Carmichael's medical supplies, even her family's historical guilt about the missing bell clapper. You positioned yourself as the helpful novice while manipulating everyone's trust." Peter's composure shattered completely. "He deserved it." The words erupted with 3 years of suppressed venom. "Arthur Thornfield destroyed my life at Oxford, had me expelled for examination irregularities, ruined my campanology reputation, cost me everything. I spent years planning this revenge." The confession poured out with the relief of finally abandoning his carefully constructed facade. His false identity, his systematic infiltration of St. Mary Mead, his calculated courtship of Dorothy as both cover and scapegoat, all had been elements of an elaborate revenge plot against the man who had destroyed his academic career and standing in the bell-ringing community. The beauty was the gradual poisoning, he continued with chilling pride. Small doses applied to his practice journal, the tower keys, the bell sallies. I studied his habits for months, learning exactly when and how to deliver the poison. The final dose on the 5th sally was perfectly calculated. Arthur always checked each rope before practice. As Inspector Slack entered with Constable Lake, Peter made one desperate attempt at escape, but his months of deception had weakened him more than he realized. The constant strain of maintaining false personas had taken its toll, and he stumbled at the crucial moment. While they secured him, Peter continued his venomous confessions, as if the relief of revealing his true nature outweighed any concern for consequences. His hatred for Arthur Thornfield had consumed him so completely that destroying the man had become more important than his own survival. Miss Marple watched the proceedings with sad understanding. She had encountered such calculating evil before. Individuals whose intelligence and charm masked hearts capable of methodical cruelty. Peter Ashford had proven himself a master of deception, using everyone's trust and affection as weapons in his carefully orchestrated revenge. As they led him away, still ranting about Arthur's deserved fate, Miss Marple reflected on how close his plan had come to succeeding. Without careful observation of human nature's revealing details, Dorothy Hartwell would certainly have been convicted of murder. While Peter achieved both his revenge and freedom, tomorrow would bring the difficult process of healing for a community systematically manipulated by someone they had welcomed as a friend. The arrest of Peter Ashford sent tremors through St. Mary Mead that would resonate long after the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The village found itself confronting the uncomfortable truth that they had welcomed a calculating murderer into their midst, someone whose charming facade had concealed years of methodical planning for revenge. The immediate reckoning. Dorothy Hartwell emerged from her ordeal with quiet dignity, though the experience had fundamentally altered her perspective on human nature. She returned to the library with renewed dedication, but Miss Marple observed a new wariness in her interactions with strangers, a hard-earned wisdom about the masks people could wear. The botanical books that had seemed such damning evidence were quietly returned to their proper shelves, their margins bearing faint pencil notations that would serve as permanent reminders of how knowledge could be twisted to serve malevolent purposes. "I keep thinking there must have been signs," Dorothy confided to Miss Marple during one of their afternoon visits. "Some indication of his true nature that I should have recognized. He seemed so genuinely concerned about everyone's welfare." Miss Marple understood the particular torment of those who had been manipulated by skilled deceivers. "My dear, predators often succeed precisely because they appear most helpful and trustworthy. Peter spent years perfecting his ability to exploit human kindness. That says nothing about your judgment and everything about his calculated cruelty." Mrs. Carmichael's redemption. Mrs. Carmichael struggled most visibly with the aftermath, her usual efficiency replaced by anxious self-doubt. The revelation that Peter had systematically exploited her family's historical shame about the missing bell clapper left her questioning every conversation they had shared. Yet, in an unexpected way, the exposure of the 1919 scandal brought her a strange sort of liberation. The weight of secrecy that Peter had so expertly manipulated was finally lifted, allowing her to address the historical irregularities honestly rather than living in fear of their discovery. She made a tearful statement to the police, admitting her unwitting compliance in Peter's schemes while maintaining her innocence of the actual murder. The chemical burns on her hands, Dr. Haydock confirmed, were consistent with accidental contact from cleaning containers Peter had borrowed and returned. Inspector Slack, lacking enthusiasm for prosecuting vicars' wives in the absence of clear criminal intent, accepted her confession of imprudence rather than guilt. The official resolution. The trial, when it came, provided the final details of Peter's elaborate revenge scheme. His expulsion from Oxford for examination fraud had indeed destroyed his promising academic career, but his subsequent years had been spent not in honest rebuilding but in meticulous preparation for vengeance. Court documents revealed the sophisticated nature of his planning. False identity documents, carefully researched poisons, and a comprehensive understanding of village dynamics that had taken months to develop. Most chilling was the psychological evaluation ordered by the court, which painted a portrait of someone whose considerable intelligence had been entirely corrupted by obsessive hatred. Peter's ability to maintain multiple false personas while systematically poisoning his victim demonstrated a level of calculating evil that disturbed even experienced legal professionals. His apparent devotion to Dorothy had been pure performance, his romantic gestures merely tools in his comprehensive manipulation of the community's trust. Inspector Slack, to his credit, acknowledged that his rush to arrest Dorothy had nearly resulted in a grave miscarriage of justice. His official report praised Miss Marple's observational skills, though he privately grumbled about amateur interference with proper police procedures. The investigation had revealed how Peter's false identity as a bell-ringing novice had provided perfect cover for infiltrating the community and gaining intimate access to his victim. Restoration and renewal. The bell tower itself required considerable attention before normal activities could resume. Dr. Haydock's examination had revealed traces of cyanide compounds on multiple surfaces, evidence of Peter's systematic campaign over several months. The fifth sally, which had delivered the fatal dose, was replaced entirely, and the entire ringing chamber was thoroughly cleaned and blessed by Reverend Fletcher before the bells could sound again. When the bell ringers finally returned to the tower, it was with a new member recruited from a neighboring village, someone whose credentials could be thoroughly verified. Dorothy, at Miss Marple's quiet encouragement, asked to join them. The first pattern they attempted was plain bob doubles, simple and brave, its bronze voices climbing into the autumn air with a clarity that seemed to cleanse the tower of its dark memories. Miss Marple's final reflection. As the seasons turned and life in St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its familiar rhythms, Miss Marple found herself reflecting often on the case while tending her garden roses. Peter Ashford had possessed considerable intelligence and remarkable patience, qualities that might have served him well in honest pursuits. Instead, he had chosen to corrupt these gifts in service of revenge so consuming that it had ultimately destroyed him as thoroughly as his intended victim. The village had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of accepting appearances without question, though Miss Marple hoped they would not allow healthy skepticism to replace their natural warmth toward newcomers. The balance between trust and caution was delicate, requiring the kind of careful observation she had spent a lifetime perfecting. The bells ring again. On a crisp Sunday morning in late autumn, the church bells of St. Mary's resumed their regular call to worship. Their bronze voices carried across the village with mathematical precision, just as they had for centuries, bearing witness to both the darkness and light that resided in every community. The villagers paused at doorways, in gardens, by the green, listening to sounds that were both ordinary and miraculous at once. Miss Marple sat in her front room with a new skein of blue wool, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be another baby's booty. Through her window, she could see the peaceful scene that had been so violently disrupted and was now, slowly but surely, healing itself. Human nature, she reflected, was indeed a tapestry woven with threads of light and shadow, and sometimes the darkest threads were hidden in the most unexpected places. Peter Ashford's mistake had been believing that intelligence alone could triumph over the deeper wisdom that came from genuine understanding of the human heart. Evil, however clever, rarely succeeded indefinitely against those who understood how to observe it properly. When the last change finished perfectly, the bells lay still a moment, as if listening to their own echo. Then the pigeons settled, the elm leaves breathed, and life went forward, carrying the memory of a silent murder, and the knowledge, once more, that even the gentlest places required watchful eyes. Miss Marple snipped her thread, tidy and exact, and reached for the next stitch, ready as always for whatever human mysteries tomorrow might bring.